is subject to vetoes from 5 countries. One of those countries is the Russian Federation. It has vetoed any meaningful response to the Ukraine crisis. But then the issue moved to the General Assembly, because the General Assembly can discuss peace and security issues if the Security Council is deadlocked or otherwise not acting. And the vote in the General Assembly was a crushing defeat for the Russian Federation. So in that sense, while the Security Council is the most kinetic organ of the UN, it isn't the only one able to deal with security crises.
Entirely agree, David. Thank you very much for that. So what is your expectation going forward from the UN, the outcomes from the UN General Assembly resolution? Do you expect it to in any way change the outcome of what's going on in Ukraine at this time?
I think the most useful role of the UN is to provide a platform for all sorts of exchanges of information, views. It's not the only such platform, but it's the most universal such platform. So, for example, we know from the vote in the General Assembly that while overall it was a crushing defeat for the Russian Federation, there were 2 continents which are of mixed minds over the matter. One is Africa, because Africa is hugely dependent on donors, but it's also dependent on both China and to a lesser extent the Russian Federation. And so half of the African countries abstain. And in Asia, Asian countries prefer not to take sides if they can avoid it. So Japan, for example, where normally I live, I'm in New York right now, Japan voted to condemn the invasion of Ukraine, but a number of countries preferred to abstain, in part because they felt they didn't understand the issue well enough, but in part because they'd rather not take sides in a dispute.
Thank you, David. And I think we'll talk with Regine as well about some of the consequences of that resolution, for example, on Bangladesh and its vote. So we'll get to that just in a moment. One more question, David, before we move to Regine. So, of course, NATO and the UN are 2 very different institutions, one being, as you said, the #1 forum for international relations, but the other being a military alliance with teeth. So when you see from where you are NATO acting with great unity on Ukraine, which of course is not an alliance member, does that give you more faith in the multilateral system, or does it concern you that this action is once again taking place outside of the Security Council?
No, I think it's NATO is an alliance of countries. It isn't the same as the UN at all. I think they each play an important role, NATO for its membership, and other countries always take note of what NATO is planning to do. But the UN is a semi-universal platform. So in that, they're very different. I think if there was a mistake countries like Canada made over the past 30 years, it was that thinking that a conflict might never recur, that somehow with the Cold War having ended, we had entered a period of no global conflicts, perhaps regional conflicts would continue to proliferate, and we turned out to be wrong about that. So reinvesting in NATO is, in my view, a good idea for Canada. But many Canadians will defer. The great thing about Canada is there's lots of disagreement about everything.
Thank you very much. Well said. And that actually is a great segue to bring Regine into the conversation, because Regine, you were very much involved in the foreign policy by Canadians process. So you saw the disagreements that occurred among your group when they looked at multilateral issues. So could you begin by telling us what you saw through that process and what it told you about Canadians' perceptions of the World Health Organization in particular?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Rory. So I think Canadians in general, one of the key themes that emerged from the discussions that we were hearing among the Canadians were having amongst themselves about the WHO is that they really understood the role of the WHO as a leading authority in matters of global health. And I think the pandemic also reinforced this notion that global health is also a foreign policy issue that very much requires engagement with from diplomats and from various arms of Canada's foreign policy branches. But one of the key things that emerged from the discussions was also that Canadians wanted to see where their money, or what was the value for money that they were getting from their government investing in the WHO. And so the relationship that they were describing was really one that was transactional, as opposed to in the past where international organizations really held sort of this idealistic perception in the view of the general public as just institutions of moral authority and institutions that have weight in and or value in and of themselves. Canadians wanted to see what the WHO was bringing out to them. And really this discussion was tinged a bit with the discussion with the first year of the pandemic, what they perceived to be failures in the first year of the pandemic from the WHO. And again, the key issue around here was what are we getting from funding the WHO? And the question of funding, I think that one of the easiest ways to conceptualize this question of should we be funding the WHO more, what does it really do for us, is a question of which comes first, the chicken or the egg. So what I mean by that is that the whole world gets out of the WHO what it is willing to put into it. WHO has two general overarching types of funding. It has assessed contributions, which are mandatory contributions, and it has voluntary earmarked funding. And WHO at the moment, just over 20% of its funding comes from mandatory assessed contributions that every country that is a member state of WHO donates or gives to the WHO as part of its membership dues. The other 80% really is earmarked funding. So it's funding that every country individually says, this is what I'm giving you money for. This is what I want. This is the health priority. I want this money to go towards. And that has three consequences for how the WHO can really operate, or three hindrances. The first is that we have certain health issues that are chronically underfunded at the WHO. And these are things like non-communicable diseases, but also emergency preparedness. Emergencies and health emergencies in general are among those issues where, when they're not occurring, we as a general public don't see the value in investing. And when it suddenly is occurring, and probably in the immediate aftermath, there is this push to increase funding towards emergency preparedness. But after that excitement of the aftermath we surpass that, really we enter a lull phase where we forget what was the consequence of lack of preparedness. So that's the first consequence. The second consequence, of course, is that WHO is perceived as not being independent because of the fact that it doesn't have predictable, sustainable, and flexible funding. And the third consequence is that it's also subject to politicization. What I mean by that, again, is that we saw in the middle of the pandemic, at the height of the pandemic, the Trump administration essentially announcing that it plans to withdraw from the organization. Now, the withdrawal didn't take effect because it had submitted its notice, and the notice would have taken effect in a year's time. So luckily, by then, the Biden administration had come in, and so there was no more withdrawal of WHO as a question. But that was at the height of the pandemic, when the United States is WHO's largest contributor. So the question around funding the WHO and what we get out of it is really a question of which comes first, the chicken or the egg. Are we willing to put in the money to see WHO operating at its optimal performance?
Thank you so much, Regine. So I'm gonna show you how naive or unaware I am. How much do we fund the WHO? Like, what is their total budget? Do you know that?
Yeah, sure. The WHO's total budget, I haven't looked at the figure exactly at the moment, but I know it's just over, I believe, and I have to go back and check, it's just over 2 billion, I believe. And that is roughly the budget of a medium-sized research hospital in the US. So just sort of to give a comparison, that is what the WHO is running on at the moment. And it has a few big contributions from the states like the United States and from Germany, and others have markedly less a contribution towards WHO.
Yeah, I mean, $2 billion is a lot for one person, but not so much for global pandemic, universal multilateral response. Now, based on what you saw from Canadians and foreign policy by Canadians, do you think they would be, or were they happy to hear that 80% of funding is earmarked? Do you think that's something that ordinary Canadians, like, is there a natural propensity to say that's a good thing? And you've noted all the pitfalls of that.
Yeah, so I think that when we had this discussion around increasing assessed contributions to WHO and moving away from earmarked contributions, there was an understanding that we did need that flexibility. We did need to fund an organization sustainably to respond to emergencies when they arise. But, and this is also the discussion that's happening right now with the WHO Committee on Sustainable Financing that's looking at this issue at the moment and as we speak, is that whenever there's an increase in assessed contributions, there's also an expectation of greater transparency from the organization, more reports on where the money is going, and more accountability. And so whether the WHO has done enough or not is up for debate. But I think Canadians generally also mimicked what we're seeing right now as discussions that are happening at WHO's executive board, and also our discussions that are happening at the World Health Assembly, that if WHO is to receive more money, mandatory contributions from us, and less earmarked funding, we really need to see in a very transparent way, and probably in a real-time way, where that money is going and how it's being accounted for.
And to get that level of transparency requires funding as well, though, doesn't it? That doesn't just happen naturally.
So the chicken and the egg, yeah.
Exactly. Thank you, Regine. Well, I'm going to go back to David now, and we have a couple of interesting questions already coming in from the audience, and I would just encourage you to ask your questions, ideally in the Q&A, but I'm watching the chat as well, so either one will work. And so the first question, David, and you sort of opened this question about Canadian foreign policy and the way that we've been looking at the world the last 30 years in terms of conflict and war. So that, I think that's brought out some interest. And now Canada is a part of many multilateral institutions, probably more than any other country. For example, the Commonwealth, the Francophonie, and then obviously NATO, the UN, there are many more. But so that begs the question that we had coming in here. I'm just trying to get the name from Lou. So Lou was asking about Canada's failure to secure a seat at the Security Council in 2020. He said that appeared to mark a significant loss of respect and prestige over the last 10 years of both Liberal and Conservative governments. And I would note that both governing parties have lost an election recently, and it's been now 22 years since Canada sat on the Security Council. What does Canada need to do to rehabilitate its reputation in the UN and in other international institutions?
I think Canada doesn't need to do much. Why? Its positive reputation never went away. Bob Rae is the current Canadian ambassador at the UN in New York. He's hugely influential within the organization. It was a very good appointment. We lost the Security Council campaigns, the last two, as you mentioned, Rory, for very different reasons. Mr. Harper entered office very skeptical about developing countries, which he then didn't know much about. Today, he's very knowledgeable about a number of developing countries, including India. But when he was first prime minister, he wasn't. And he was fairly categorical in his contempt for Africa, for example, as seeing it as a continent that wasn't pulling its own weight and pulling up its socks, so to speak. And that coincided with a spat that the foreign minister, John Baird, got himself into with an Arab country, the United Arab Emirates, right before the election. So in one fell swoop, Canada lost Africa and lost all the Arab countries, as far as I could make out. That was the election about 15 years ago or 14 years ago. The recent election, I think, was simply mismanaged by the government. Different government, different approach. I don't think the Prime Minister invested himself in it enough early enough. We entered the race after our two competitors. Our two competitors were very popular countries in the UN, Ireland and Norway. Norway is the most generous donor per capita in the world, unless it happens to be Sweden this week. But Norway's been hugely generous. Canada has become a miser on foreign aid. So frankly, look no further than politicians who tend to how can I say, believe their own propaganda that Canada is self-evidently fabulous, which the Canadian public loves hearing, but doesn't do much for us internationally. Canada, the rest of the world, particularly developing countries, see us relocating, for example, many of their best educated citizens to Canada from countries in desperate need of people who are highly educated. So Canada's self-image, I'm afraid, is not particularly shared in the developing world, and Canada needs to do a much better job in reconnecting. It's not enough to go to a Francophone summit or a Commonwealth summit and pose for photos. It requires hard work, personal engagement, and seriousness, of which there's been remarkably little, in my view, with the exception of one or two of the current cabinet's members.
Thank you, David. And yes, I agree. It is a question of wanting it enough to be able to make the changes inside your foreign policy as a whole to reorient around something like the UN and to meet the expectations of 193 members. Of course, being on the Security Council, you go there and you're a non-permanent member, an elected member with no veto power. And a question came in, what is your opinion about amending the permanent seat in the UN Security Council? So maybe you could touch on that for us.
Well, I'd be all in favor of a reform of the membership of the council, particularly the veto carrying 5 permanent members. But the truth is, each of those members can veto any change in the way the charter sets out the parameters and limits of any reform to the Security Council. So I think it's simply not going to happen in the foreseeable future. What we'd like to see more of, and that Bob Ray is working very hard on at the moment, as far as I can make out, is to give the General Assembly much more voice in challenging the Security Council at times and doing what it can do if the Security Council is paralyzed. So that's a role that Canada played in the 1950s. You'll remember that the Suez crisis response, the UN's first large-scale peacekeeping mission, that Lester Pearson and his team advocated, occurred as a result of a vote in the General Assembly, not in the Security Council. So the action will, if the Council is deadlocked for any amount of time, the action will revert to the General Assembly, and Canada will have more opportunity to matter if Canada wants to matter.
Well said, thank you. We did have a question here, Rugine, that was in the chat. And the question was, do Canadians generally support the notion of multilateral institutions and their roles in the world? And I thought, because we really focused in on the WHO and foreign policy by Canadians, could you give us your impressions of the representative public view of one multilateral institution, which was the WHO? Would you be willing to go into a bit more of the general approach that people had towards that institution? And also what you see through all of your research, of course. You can go broader than that. Yeah, thank you.
Sure, thanks, Rory. So in terms of the view of Canadians of multilateral institutions, and in particular WHO, I think I touched on it a bit earlier, but basically Canadians, my understanding and my perception is that Canadians view multilateral institutions as being important, that they do support funding them, they do support supporting in multilateral institutions, but also more generally, Canadians did understand the importance of multilateralism itself, right? So for instance, through increasing contributions through overseas development aid, they were in favor of continuing to help developing countries in the post-pandemic recovery. And they also viewed the role of the WHO as being critical to all this, right? So the role of the WHO in both guiding the emergency response and also guiding the recovery. Where I think Canadians also exhibit a bit of hesitation is more so where bureaucratic layers are introduced, or where they perceive an additional, for instance, we posed a question around a global health ambassador. Should that be something that Canada considers as useful? And that's where Canadians, I think, harbored some hesitations, right? What does the global health ambassador do? What is the added contribution of that? So yes to supporting the multilateral institutions, but with strings attached and with understanding where their money is going. I think that was the bottom line.
And wasn't there also a question about the WHO potentially intervening into countries with less than full consent? And the response from the Canadians was quite tepid towards that, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So in a way, Canadians had an understanding of the principle of sovereignty, just like any other international lawyer would have. So they understood that it is extremely difficult to get a country to accept WHO's invitate or WHO's decision to enter a country and investigate a potential outbreak without consent from that country. So right now there are multiple global health law reform initiatives underway. So we're discussing, for instance, a pandemic treaty, and whether states consent to such a power for WHO is really up for debate, but it seems very unlikely, especially in this current political climate, that states are willing to retract from their their stronghold on the principle of sovereignty to do so. And I think Canadians understood that and reflected that in their responses as well.
Exactly, thank you. So I did want to continue on. We did talk about Ukraine already, Rugine, and I wanted to open up by mentioning that in case anyone hasn't heard, Lithuania, they canceled the decision to donate over 400,000 COVID-19 vaccine doses to Bangladesh after the country abstained from the General Assembly's vote on Russia. What do you make of that decision? And maybe you could use that as an opportunity to talk about our efforts. I'm going to ask you next about our efforts in vaccine distribution globally. Sure.
So I wrote a piece about this in Open Canada, I think a few days ago, basically describing the fact that wars and pandemics are intertwined, and the polarization that, much of the world supports Ukraine in this crisis, but there is as David has mentioned, there is a handful that have withheld from overt criticism of Russia. And that has potential impact on global health diplomacy as well, being the manifestation that you just mentioned around Lithuania canceling the donation of vaccines to Bangladesh. And so right now, the world is in a situation where 85% of people living in the continent of Africa have yet to receive a single dose of vaccines. And we're now also potentially facing polarization of the international community and these problematic manifestations of global health diplomacy. So where we go next, I mean, this was just one example. Whether we'll see more of them is really out. The verdict is out. But we certainly do need to, especially at this point in time, increase our contributions to COVAX, increase our donations, our bilateral donations to countries. The COVID recovery needs to be something that is viewed separately from the war and needs to be something that is still prioritized as in and of itself as an important as a global health priority.
And what are the biggest risks from having a major conflagration like this occurring in the midst of a pandemic and a very virulent variant?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so with the Ukraine war very hot right now, what can we expect to see as a result, as a consequence, in the neighboring countries regarding the COVID-19?
Well, I think that generally wars and situations of war create. I think Bruce Aylward from WHO said this well, that wars always create the conditions on which infectious diseases thrive. So the potential, not only just for instance, the people being grouped and huddled together in bomb shelters, or being huddled together in refugee camps, or generally running away from the situation and being close together, that creates a condition through which the virus can actually continue to transmit itself and potentially can lead to evolution of the virus and potentially a variant of concern. As the case is also the same in the continent of Africa, where I mentioned again that 85% of people have yet to receive a single dose. So the war is, I think, adding on top of that another potential risk for variants of concern to emerge, and which basically means that this pandemic is far from over, and in fact is probably getting accelerated in terms of its next step or its next trajectory.
May I add to that, and Rujine's been absolutely terrific on the health issues she's been discussing, that I think Lithuania's decision is a mistake, taken at a passionate moment over an issue that is, really very, very important to Lithuania, much more important than Canada. But why do I think it's a mistake? People in Bangladesh, that's 400,000 people who will not be either immunized or fully immunized against a potentially fatal disease. And it's misfiring, in my view. Bangladesh remains a poor country. It's done pretty well in its development track, but I think punishing it for an abstention in the General Assembly on an issue it may feel it didn't have enough knowledge of to make a firm decision, I think it's a flat out mistake, morally and otherwise.
And
I would ask.
Yeah, go ahead, Rashid. Okay. Well, I don't know if anyone on the call, and we have over 100 right now, but if we have any Lithuania domestic political experts on the call, I would certainly appreciate any insight you have, because it may be a question of good domestic politics as well, at a very challenging time for them. But yeah, I would have to agree that this is a big mistake. Now, here's a question that both of you may be able to answer from Stephen Hoffman. What should the role of UN human rights treaties in guiding the world's responses to global health emergencies like COVID-19 be? I haven't heard many governments make reference to their international human rights obligations at any point during the pandemic. David, would you like to start?
Sure, very good point. And so a very sharp question. And I agree with the thrust of the question. I think basic human rights are being challenged and in parts of the countries overridden in the Ukraine, but human rights have disappeared from the picture. In the media, it's all about the violence. It isn't about basic rights. It's all about the military dimension. It isn't about what the people of Ukraine might want. And so I think it's occluded from view. And I think that's been a shortcoming of media coverage, but also perhaps government response, not just in Canada, but many governments' responses. Non-prioritization of the human rights dimension of this crisis, which extends to the right to self-determination.
Regine?
Yeah, and I to add to that and to look at it from the global health perspective. So throughout this pandemic, we've heard many statements, many resolutions being issued from countries, from forums like the G7, the G20, and in all of them, there's really a complete, even over the past 2 years of the COVID pandemic, there's a complete, as David said, I think a subjecting of human rights to the peripheries. It's not discussing that as an international legal obligation. And in particular, as we're looking to the pandemic treaty reforms, again, this is not a principle that's being emphasized. What Canada has done, which is brilliant, much better than other countries from what I've heard so far in pandemic treaty negotiations, is emphasize the principle of solidarity and equity, which are, of course, sisters or related concepts to human rights obligations, but are not obligations in and of themselves. And so we do need to bring out the right to health, which is a constitutional obligation under the World Health Organization's constitution. And that entails a whole series of other obligations, including obligations to help another country in times of emergencies, whether they be national security emergencies or global health emergencies, obligations to share access to vaccines and all that sort of thing. So it has all those implications. And we're just not seeing that being discussed among countries at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. I think that might lead into Clara's question, actually. So here's Clara's question. In a more general setting, it is now commonly recognized that the multilateral system that emerged after World War II is outdated. Bretton Woods institutions, for example, are considered not to be representative of the current global reality, and countries such as China are up to building their own institutions. How do you envision a potential reform of the multilateral system? What role could the UN play in it, and what reforms would it need to do so? I will go to David first. But Regine, I think there's an answer in there directly onto the WHO, which you might be able to work in as well. Go ahead, David.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think, the post-Second World War multilateral system is aging. It's, 75 or more years old now, 76. And the World Bank and IMF were created even before the UN in 1944, rather than 1945, when the negotiation took place at Bretton Woods. So it's an aging system. It doesn't, I think the questioner is quite right, it's a slightly sclerotic system. The World Bank and the IMF had a wake-up call at the time of their failed policies on developing country indebtedness, trying to force structural adjustment on countries that simply could not adjust. They were too poor to adjust any further. And so they had a very humbling moment about 30 years ago, realizing they weren't emperors of the universe. And they've been quite a bit more humble since then. The UN has been aware for quite a long time, or those of us inside the UN system, that virtually all of its activities would benefit from different structures today, but the member states have trouble agreeing on any reforms to the UN. There's no faster way to get a deadlock in the UN than start suggesting specific reforms of the system. So in that sense, it's been widely felt more sensible in the UN context to introduce incremental changes, sometimes changes by stealth. I'm not sure that's the right approach at all myself, but that's what's been happening. I think the WHO also suffers from a degree of sclerosis and challenge from outside actors. For example, the WHO was weakened very much unintentionally by Bill Gates and his obsession with vertical funds to fight individual diseases, tuberculosis, malaria, and so on. And that actually, money was withdrawn from the World Health Organization in part to fund those vertical funds that Gates was generous in funding, but he expected others to be generous too, including member states. So I think Gates is much more aware today of the limitations of his strategy. Not all of it worked, far from it. And it did weaken the WHO considerably, and that was a huge cost to pay.
Is there a future for the UN, working more closely with our most giving billionaires, or should we be cautious based on that example that you just gave us, David?
Well, I think that the billionaires are useful in reminding governments that they need to help. And that if they don't, others will take over. That's a useful message to governments. You may be about to lose one of your areas of competence or so-called competence. But frankly, often they proceed on the basis of an obsession with a single issue, whereas the WHO has to knit together many, many health challenges at any given time. And even with the pandemic claiming all the headlines, WHO had to go on working, of course, on many other diseases, which over time claim many more lives than COVID is likely to.
Regine, I would love to hear your views on reform of multilateral institutions, particularly the WHO. And I'll take the opportunity to quote from your recent article. You wrote that solidarity and trust are essential, not only to the social fabric of our communities, but also to global institutions that build our collective resilience against social health and security crises. And you did note that there's some reform underway now. So what do we need as a global community to better prepare us for the next pandemic, or to better respond to this one going forward?
Sure, thanks, Rory. So I guess just to take it one level higher, at a higher level question, before I get into the specifics, I recently read a really interesting article, and this is because it relates directly to the question that I'm mentioning it, around the fragmentation of global institutions and multilateral institutions, and why that's not necessarily a bad thing. It allows for more creativity, more innovation in the way that our multilateral institutions grow and further develop over time. So I think the incremental reforms that David mentioned is very likely the way that institutions are changing, but also in the sense that the powers at play are changing, right? We're talking about receding of the United States, gradual receding of the United States as the authority, which was not the case at the end of World War II. And so increasing voices and having more voices at the table, shifting priorities at the international level, which is, again, not necessarily a bad thing. I think that with WHO, one way the institution is changing is through potential pandemic treaty reforms. What that can do is, for instance, increase access to medical countermeasures in times of emergency, which is something the WHO has been very reluctant to wade into and up to this present moment, up to the current crisis. But also strengthening the WHO through financing reform. So the issues I mentioned at the very beginning, the governance structure of WHO itself is not, I think, bound to be changing anytime soon. It has the executive board, it has the World Health Assembly, it has a secretariat. And how these all interact with each other is, by and large, I think, by consensus, states are quite happy with that structure at the moment. It's more so the specific international laws that are at play that are shifting and changing. And I think one way to so the international health regulations, which is what we currently have as the international law governing public health emergencies, came into play after SARS. And so you really see with WHO this process of getting the courage to engage in international lawmaking efforts after some sort of crisis happens. And so crisis tends to bring countries together to think through problems that they hadn't thought through before and to develop solutions to them through international lawmaking. And in particular, with an organization like the WHO, it's very reluctant to engage in normative powers unless it has such an impetus. And so now we have that impetus, and that's where we're going to see potential shifts in priorities around public health emergency response and preparedness.
Okay, and Regine, what advice would you have to the Canadian government right now in the way that it's pushing for WHO reform? What would you be looking for from the Canadian government?
I would like,
go on. Ahead, Jean, sorry.
And then David.
Please go ahead. Okay, well, I guess I have just a quick wish list. I would like our government to be the voice of a pandemic treaty that is fair, that is equitable, that manages to integrate the voices of the Global South and the needs of the Global South in that treaty as well. We at the moment have an international health regulations treaty, agreement, international legal agreement, which is a good agreement. But it doesn't include all those unique particularities to this pandemic that we now see as being necessary. For instance, again, access to medical countermeasures in times of emergency, helping to build, creating an actual obligation, like a firm legal obligation of a pooled fund to build every country's health capacity to respond and detect to public health emergencies. These are what we're not seeing in the IHR, the International Health Regulations, and what I hope to see the Canadian government championing moving forward.
David?
Great. Could you remind me of the core question, Rory? Sorry.
Oh, no problem. Yeah. So the question was, what advice would you have to the Canadian government now vis-a-vis its approach to the World Health Organization and the pandemic? But feel free to broaden that somewhat to our approach to the UN and multilateral institutions.
Well, I think, first of all, the Canadian public seems a lot less supportive of multilateral approaches. We've become a louder country. People's views are expressed more strongly. In a way, we're more American than we used to be. And in a way, we saw that with the alleged freedom lovers taking over Ottawa for 3 weeks, feeling they had a basic human right to inconvenience hundreds of thousands of people, as well as paralyzing the government, as they hoped. That is not something that happens every day in Canada historically. So I think it's not just an issue for government, I think it's an issue for Canadians too. How much are we willing to invest in international relations? Do we see the world, the rest of the world primarily as a pool for us to pick out desirable immigrants? Or do we actually think the rest of the world is important to us in every sphere, not just trade or immigration or as a recipient of the much diminished Canadian aid program, but how interested are we in the rest of the world? So I think that is and how much do we prioritize the rest of the world? So I think that's as much a challenge for Canadians as it is for the government. And perhaps the government losing its bearings a bit in the last Security Council election is simply a reflection that the whole issue didn't matter much in Canada.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Having been involved in the first loss, it was a 24-hour story, essentially. Certainly, through my rose-colored glasses, I expected it to be more of a story than it was. Absolutely. I think we may overestimate or underestimate the disconnect between our foreign policy and where Canadians stand, which I think is something that the foreign policy by Canadians exercise was looking to bridge. Now, David, a couple questions did come in about the UN again and the Security Council, and I guess if I could put them together, it would be: do you expect much, if anything, to change at the UN, including the Security Council, as a result of the concurrent crises right now of COVID-19 and the Ukraine war? Should we expect that events will change the UN, or is it the other way around?
Yes, events do change the UN. The end of the Cold War empowered the UN greatly. The three-cornered hostility of China, Russia, and the United States is weakening the UN. So the outside world impinges hugely on the UN and its capacity to operate well. It goes on operating one way or another, but whether it's operating well or perhaps in a perfect world optimally is something very much dependent on the citizenry of the world, on the governments of the world. And I think that commitment to international management of crisis situations, be they health or security, has unfortunately been eroding for perhaps the last 20 years or so. I often place it around the very negative reaction of President Bush, the second President Bush, to being denied a mandate in the Security Council to attack Kuwait. The Security Council was right, and President Bush was wrong, but nevertheless, the UN has paid a price for that.
Which, if I recall correctly, David, that was Colin Powell who had pushed for to take a shot at the Security Council prior to.
Well, it was really the British who wanted to take a shot at it, and Colin Powell was the American emissary who went, and he did as good a job as he could of saying, you know, of advancing the arguments, but the arguments for the use of force against the Iraqi regime were very weak. And the occupation that followed, the American occupation that followed, the Brits weren't able to contribute much to it, was a disaster for the US, as is widely recognized in the US and elsewhere now. So the nice thing is that in retirement, President Bush has been quite humble about all of this, far than being belligerent in trying to burnish his credentials. He spent his time visiting war veterans and learning how to paint. Pretty useful on balance compared to what he was like as a president.
Don't quote us. Yeah, I think regret is a powerful force, though. Just one more question for you, David, and then we'll have just any concluding remarks from both of you. This effort by Permanent Representative Bob Rae at the UN to move to bring more authority to the General Assembly actions. Do you think that the charter will really allow that to happen, or I mean,
the charter already allows it.
Yeah.
So it doesn't require the charter. What it requires is a change in habits at the UN. Instead of constantly deferring to the Security Council, the General Assembly might occasionally telegraph to the Council, if you don't do something decisive, we will.
Mm.
And that will attract the attention of the council. But actually, the General Assembly has become much too deferential. The International Court of Justice helped build substance into the capacity of the General Assembly to act on peace and security issues in the 1950s and 1960s, notably over the Middle East, as I mentioned, and the Congo. And the General Assembly seemed to have forgotten that. It had allowed itself to be mesmerized by the council. Big mistake.
Hmm. All right, thank you. That might be a subject for another another meeting for sure. Thank you, David. Now, we're just about out of time here, but Regine, in the last maybe 60 seconds or so, did you want to have any conclusions, anything you want to add, advice for policymakers or for those who are listening at this point and what they might be able to do to support multilateral institutions like the WHO?
Sure, thanks, Rory. So I think what, the key theme in all this is really the understanding of the interactions between multilateral institutions and governments and the people of governments, what they choose, what they want their governments to prioritize as foreign policy issues. We're not living in a single issue world. We're not living in a world where there's only one crisis and not another. And what I wrote in Open Canada was that crises, and in particular pandemics, don't necessarily have a timing of when they're going to strike us. They'll strike us whether the world is polarized. They'll strike us whether the world is acting together in solidarity. They do not care. The viruses do not care. They will hit us whenever they want. And the reality of all that is that we need to create solid laws and institutions that will withstand potential other crises that may happen at the same time. And so, for instance, an international security crisis. And really how we craft that is what our listeners and what all of us now need to pay attention to. In particular, I really hope everyone leaving this call gains more interest in pandemic treaty discussions, because that's something, and IHR reform discussions, because that's stuff that will impact us for the next pandemic down the line. So I hope that we do maintain that interest moving forward. And I appreciate the CIC for giving this platform, and lovely to chat with David. Thank you.
Thank you, Regine. Over to you, David, for any final words.
Well, I agree with Regine very much. I think, it's harder for all of us to keep ourselves informed of what's going on in the world nowadays. The internet is everything and nothing because there's so much of it that we can't get a grip on it, so to speak. Newspapers are collapsing in Canada and elsewhere. They used to keep us informed. TV news varies. People seem to be more interested in local issues rather than international issues. And that's a luxury, being much more interested in garbage collection than in global security. So I think we need to get a grip and re-engage with the world. Not so much the government doing that. Ministers travel nonstop in normal circumstances to meet other ministers globally. It's much more a challenge to citizens. Remain engaged with the world. And I don't think we're doing a very good job of that in Canada. I think we wallow in self-satisfaction and how fabulous Canada is.
All right. Well, thank you very much to both Regine and David for your excellent interventions today. It was really great. We're out of time. I do have one request for our attendees, which is click on the link, cic.org, become a member. I mean, first of all, you should be a member already, and I don't know why you aren't. But if for some reason you aren't and you still found your way here, please click the link, leave it open, check it out later. Just have a look at it, because we are looking for new members. And if you like this event, we have these going on every week across the country, and you can access many of these events from Victoria all the way to the East Coast. So thank you both. Thanks to both of you once again. Thank you, Caroline, for helping organize from CIC Hamilton, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you to Regine, and thank you to David, and thanks to our audience.
Thank you so much. And Regine, it was wonderful meeting you.
You too. Thank you so much, David.
Bye. And Rory, thanks so much for moderating us very well.
It was fun and great to reconnect with you, David.
Absolutely. Bye.
Bye.